Most people think Generation X is fine, not struggling, not loud, not dramatic. But here's the uncomfortable psychology truth. Feeling fine is often what happens when you learn very early to stay quiet, handle things alone, and never expect support. And that invisible pattern didn't just shape how you work, it shaped how you think, trust, and relate to yourself. If you were born between 1965 and 1980, there's a good chance you learned independence before you learned safety. You learned competence before connection. And you learned to keep going, even when no one was watching. That builds discipline, resilience, and productivity, but it also leaves a mental residue no one talks about. A quiet pressure. A sense that rest feels earned, not allowed. This video isn't about blaming your past, it's about upgrading your mindset with clarity. Because once you understand the invisible emotional patterns that shaped Generation X, you stop carrying weight that was never meant to be permanent. You start reclaiming mental focus, time management, and personal growth on your terms. And if part of you feels seen already, stay with me. The real shift comes when you realize what to keep and what to finally let go. Generation X grew up learning how to disappear in plain sight. Not ignored on purpose, just quietly skipped. Public debates jumped from baby boomers straight to millennials and Gen Z, leaving Gen X operating behind the scenes. That invisibility shaped a very specific mindset. Do the work, don't ask for applause. Over time, this created a strong sense of self-development rooted in competence, not validation. You don't chase attention, you chase results. And that rewires how productivity, discipline, and personal growth show up in daily life. Most Gen Xers were latchkey kids before the term even existed. You came home to an empty house, figured things out, and handled problems alone. That wasn't neglect, it was autonomy training. Actions had consequences immediately. Miss the bus? Walk. Forget lunch? Learn. This high-contingency environment trained mental focus fast. Your brain learned early, what I do matters. That's a powerful life lesson, and it explains why time management feels instinctive for you, not theoretical. This independence built confidence, but also a quiet pressure to never need help. You learn to trust yourself more than systems, more than promises, more than authority. That's why Gen X tends to value skill over status and execution over talk. In work, you respect people who can do, not just explain. In mindset terms, that's practical intelligence, the kind that gets things done when motivation fades. It's discipline without drama, self-development without hashtags. But here's where this foundation starts to bend. When you grow up invisible and self-reliant, you also learn to keep expectations low, just in case. That survival skill worked beautifully in childhood. Later in life, though, it quietly reshapes how you approach trust, stability, and emotional exposure. And that's where the story gets more complicated, because the same independence that built strength also planted the seeds of something else. And to understand that shift, you have to look at what Gen X witnessed next. After learning independence early, Gen X learned something even harder. Don't trust stability. They watched divorces become normal, companies collapse overnight, and secure jobs vanish without warning. So the brain adapted. Psychologically, this creates defensive pessimism, expecting disruption as a form of protection. It's not negativity, it's risk management. That mindset quietly shapes discipline, decision-making, and how you approach personal growth. Prepare for impact, don't get comfortable. This is why Gen X often sounds skeptical when others talk about guarantees. Promises feel fragile, titles feel temporary. Even relationships are approached with realism, not fantasy. From a mindset perspective, the brain learned to scan for weak signals early. That's powerful for productivity and survival, but it also trains you to hold back emotionally. You don't assume things will last. You assume they must be maintained. That belief runs deep, especially in how you manage time, effort, and expectations. Now layer in privacy. Gen X grew up in a world where your life wasn't public content. No feeds, no audience, no digital memory. So oversharing feels unnatural, even dangerous. While younger generations build identity online, Gen X protects it offline. This isn't fear, it's boundary intelligence. Your mental focus stays internal. Your self-development happens quietly. You don't document progress, you become it. And that difference changes how confidence is built and expressed. But here's the tension. When you combine defensive pessimism with strong privacy, You create emotional armor that works too well. It keeps chaos out, but it can also keep growth signals muted. You stay functional, capable, and composed, yet rarely seen or fully understood. And that's where Gen X developed a unique coping style, one that doesn't look like vulnerability, but sounds a lot like humor. And that's where things get interesting. When emotional armor gets heavy, the mind looks for pressure valves. For Gen X, that valve became irony. Humor wasn't just entertainment, it was psychological insulation. Growing up under Cold War anxiety, economic uncertainty, and mixed messages from authority, irony created distance from fear. Laugh first, feel later. That coping style protected mental focus, but it also trained a habit of emotional detachment. You don't dramatize pain. You make a joke, move on, and stay functional. Irony gave Gen X a sharp edge, observational, skeptical, fast to spot nonsense. But it also created a blind spot. If everything is joked about, nothing feels urgent. From a mindset angle, irony can delay emotional processing. You stay composed, productive, and efficient, while unresolved tension quietly accumulates. It's not weakness, it's deferred maintenance. And deferred maintenance always shows up later. Usually when life slows down just enough to feel it. That same realism shaped Gen X's work ethic. Jobs weren't resume experiments. They were real, often early and sometimes rough. Paper routes, retail shifts, factory floors. Work meant responsibility, not self-expression. So loyalty shifted, not to companies, but to competence. You don't trust brands, you trust skills. That's why Gen X values action over recognition. You don't need applause to know you're effective. Productivity is the reward. But here's the quiet consequence. When you combine irony with extreme competence, you become excellent at carrying weight alone. You fix problems without announcing them. You adapt without asking permission. And over time, that rewires how you relate to power, leadership, and authority itself. Because once you realize systems fail, you stop worshiping titles and start testing people. And that changes everything about how respect is earned. Once you stop trusting titles, you start testing competence. That's the Gen X relationship with authority in a nutshell. Respect isn't automatic, it's earned. Hierarchies only matter if they produce results. From a psychology standpoint, this creates a highly calibrated bullshit detector. You listen carefully, but you don't buy easily. That mindset boosts productivity and mental focus, but it also means you question systems others follow blindly. You don't rebel loudly, you disengage quietly. This explains why Gen X often thrives under pressure but struggles with shallow leadership. You work best with clear goals, autonomy, and accountability, not micromanagement. When authority lacks substance, discipline becomes internal instead of imposed. That's powerful for self-development, but it also isolates you. You don't need permission to act, but you also don't wait for support. You move forward, trusting your own judgment more than institutional promises. Now add economic trauma, not once, but repeatedly. Gen X watched the dot-com bubble burst. Then came 2008. Careers vanished, retirement plans evaporated, stability proved fragile again. Psychology teaches that repeated financial shocks condition the brain toward diversification. That's why Gen X prefers multiple income streams, side skills, and optionality. Not greed, protection. It's long-term time management applied to survival. Never let one failure take everything with it. But this constant readiness has a cost. When you expect collapse, you rarely relax fully. You're prepared, capable, and resilient, yet always scanning. The mind stays sharp, but never truly off duty. And over time, that creates a form of hyper-self-reliance that looks like strength until it quietly turns into emotional isolation. And that's where the next pattern emerges, the one that makes Gen X brilliant in crises, but hesitant in connection. By this point, self-reliance stopped being a skill and became an identity. Gen X doesn't like asking for help, not out of pride, but conditioning. Help once meant uncertainty, delay, or disappointment. So the brain learned, handle it alone. This creates a paradoxical mindset. In emergencies, Gen X is calm, decisive, effective. In everyday life, though, this same pattern turns into silent overload. You don't collapse, you carry more. Psychologically, this is where independence crosses into anxious autonomy. You feel safest when you're the one in control. Delegation feels risky. Vulnerability feels inefficient. From a self-development angle, that limits growth without you noticing, because growth accelerates when effort is shared. Yet the habit runs deep. Solve first, speak later, or not at all. Discipline stays high, but emotional bandwidth slowly drains. This also explains Gen X's physical relationship with information. Knowledge wasn't instant. You went to libraries, you searched shelves, you earned answers. That effort wired patience and depth into learning. The same goes for fixing things. You learned how to repair instead of replace. That built mechanical intuition and real-world problem solving, the kind productivity gurus can't teach. Your mindset trusts hands-on experience more than abstract theory. But here's the friction point. When you value effort and tangibility, the modern world feels thin. Information is everywhere, but wisdom feels rare. Everything is fast, visible, optimized for clicks, not competence. And that tension doesn't just affect how Gen X learns. It reshapes how they parent, guide, and protect the next generation, trying to give more support without taking away resilience. And that balancing act changes everything. Gen X didn't just adapt to change, they translated it. They're the bridge between analog instincts and digital reality. They remember a world without constant alerts, but mastered technology without becoming dependent on it. That creates a unique mindset: flexible, skeptical, quietly competent. You use tools, but you don't let tools use you. This balance supports mental focus and time management in ways younger generations are still learning. As parents, this creates tension. Gen X wants to give their kids what they didn't have: presence, safety, emotional availability. But there's a fear underneath. Am I making them too soft, too visible, too dependent on approval? So parenting becomes a calibration exercise. More support, fewer illusions. Encouragement without entitlement. It's discipline disguised as care, rooted in life lessons learned the hard way. This is where the central paradox appears. Gen X rarely asks for help, but they offer it instinctively, quietly. No credit, no announcement. If something breaks, they fix it. If someone struggles, they step in without spotlight. This is collaborative behavior without identity branding. From a psychology standpoint, it's pro-social behavior shaped by competence, not validation. Personal growth expressed through usefulness, not visibility. But when contribution stays silent long enough, it risks becoming invisible. Even to yourself, you give, solve, stabilize, and move on. No reflection, no pause. And without reflection, growth plateaus. That's the final pattern most people miss. Because the last evolution for Gen X isn't about learning more skills, it's about updating how the mind processes effort, rest, and meaning. And that's where science offers a new lever. Neuroscience reveals something Gen X rarely talks about. Prolonged self-reliance rewires the stress system. When you solve everything internally, the brain's default mode network stays overactive. You're always on, even when resting. Cortisol doesn't spike, it simmers. That's why many Gen Xers feel capable but tired, focused but flat. Productivity remains high, yet joy feels muted. It's not burnout, it's a nervous system trained for endurance, not recovery. This matters because the brain doesn't distinguish between physical danger and psychological load. Constant competence becomes a background demand. Over time, this reduces cognitive flexibility, the ability to shift perspective, imagine new paths, or ask for input. Personal growth stalls not from laziness, but from over-efficiency. When every problem is handled alone, the mind stops exploring alternatives. Discipline turns rigid, mindset turns narrow, and growth needs openness to survive. The upgrade Gen X needs isn't more grit, it's selective softness. Science shows that shared cognition improves problem solving and emotional regulation. Talking things out isn't weakness, it offloads neural load. One practical shift: externalize thinking. Right before bed, voice note decisions. Schedule one weekly conversation where you don't fix, you reflect. This isn't therapy speak, it's cognitive hygiene. Better mental focus comes from unloading, not pushing harder. Here's the quiet reframe. Independence doesn't mean isolation. Competence doesn't require silence. The next evolution is knowing when to stay quiet and when to update the system. Gen X already mastered survival. Now it's about refinement. Less armor, more precision. The kind of growth that doesn't announce itself but changes everything underneath. Stay quiet, stay sharp, stay in progress. Now here's the part that actually matters. Understanding these emotional patterns changes nothing if you keep living on autopilot. Insight without application is just intellectual comfort. So ask yourself honestly, Where are you still relying on old survival settings that no longer serve you? Where is discipline helping you? And where is it quietly draining you? Because how to live better isn't about adding more effort, it's about updating what effort means. If you're Gen X, your strength was built in silence, but strength evolves. Real self development now means knowing when to stay resilient and when to unload the system. Better productivity comes from clarity, not pressure. Better mindset comes from awareness, not toughness. Start small, externalize your thinking this week. Write instead of carrying it. Talk instead of looping it. Protect your mental focus the same way you once protected your independence. And if this video hit closer than expected, don't stop here. Make sure you're subscribed to Mind in Progress and turn on notifications because upgrading your mind happens one idea at a time. And before you go, there's one more layer you need. Understanding your psychology is powerful, but removing what drains it is transformational. That's exactly why you should watch the next video on your screen. I removed 10 things for 30 days. The last one completely changed how I think. Because insight builds awareness, but subtraction is what creates space for real change.